So in the beatdowns in Casper, Wyoming, on the extradition to Michigan, because I declared martial law, they brought in the Marines into the courtroom, and I was handcuffed with 10 marshals behind me, and because I was Chief Judge of the United States, and they were upset about it and upset about the court-martialing. They came in, and because I wouldn't stand for their fiction judge under a yellow fringe flag that means nothing, they started beating me up. So what they did is I was handcuffed, and they come from behind first and slapped me on the back of the head because I wouldn't stand for the judge. And I kind of went forward like that, and then they stood me up. They're like, "You're going to stand!" And they jacked me like that. And I buckled, and I come back, and I stood up because I was handcuffed. So it's kind of hard to stand when you're being punched. And so they punched me again, and they said, "This is what standing looks like," and they held me up. And the judge went out, and then he tried to come back in, and so I sat down when he was coming back in, and then they kind of let it go at that point, and then they took me into the back room, and they started beating me up. I was just standing there. I didn't make one aggressive move towards them. I was being very peaceful. And they beat the heck out of me. And the prisoners in the cells behind, they were yelling, "He's being peaceful, stop beating him up." And they passed me out. So they had me all jacked up, and they were hitting me in the sides and hitting me on the shoulders. And his thumb through my throat. I couldn't breathe, so I passed out. When I came to, they stomped on my hand, and they said, "Collusion, MFer, collusion, MFer, how does it feel?" I remember just looking at them going, pardon my language, flipping jerks. That's what I was thinking. So that night, they transferred me a couple days later, they transferred me from Platte County, Wyoming, to San Bernardino, California. And they dropped me in there in San Bernardino, California, and I wouldn't take off my clothes. And they wanted me to take my clothes off, but they were wearing yellow fringe flags with no authorization either. So I couldn't do that because I knew I was correct. So they took me around into the printing area, and they come in with guards to try to get my fingerprints, and I wouldn't give them that. So then they started whipping up on me, and it hurt. I grabbed the booking thing, and I smacked them across the face, and it hurt them. I saw they could bleed too. So that was kind of neat, but they hurt me real bad. They took their batons out, and they had the last laugh. But they didn't get my clothes, and they didn't get my fingerprints, because they're mine. And when I got out the next morning, they took me out to the yard, and they brought in the county sheriff. And the county sheriff looked at me and said, "If you don't eat, you're going to die," which means he knew that they were going to run the food against me again. I looked at him and I said, "For your flag." And he was wearing a yellow fringe flag, and he goes, "My flag?" I said, "For a death of the honor is with the claim of the better than to live in your lie." He goes, "Oh yeah, I'm lying again about my flag, huh?" I says, "Mm-hmm." He goes, "Come on with me." So I jumped in the bus with him, and he took me to the U.S. Federal Marshals, and he was yelling at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, "You don't have jurisdiction over this guy. Don't bring him back here. He messed up my guards. He messed up my booking area." And I was pretty beat up. The marshals looked at me like, what the heck? And the Federal Bureau of Prisons over there in Victorville, they flying me out of there to Oklahoma. And I was beat up. They took their black ink and caked it all over me, and I was in shorts. And then they had hit me with their batons, and I had welts on my head, several places on my head, my cheek. My arms were all black and blue. It hurt. But I did see that night that they can bleed. So I was kind of had some peace inside that, hey man, too. It felt good, but it didn't feel good because I had a headache because I got hit so many times. It hurt. They moved me out of there to Oklahoma City, where I met that Rear Admiral, and then off to Michigan. When I won the trials in Michigan, I was real disappointed in Dave because in Michigan, I was standing my ground. I did my judges' moves. They moved me to the right side of the courtroom as the plaintiff, and they brought Dave in for trial. I was expecting him to stand his ground, and he took the fiction oath. Yeah, they administered their oath to him. Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? Which is an adverb, verb, adjective, pronoun statement. It says nothing. And he made two tries to take his oath, the correct oath, in syntax. And after the second time, they surrounded him with U.S. Marshals, and I figured I was going to get to see my treatment. Wow, I'm going to get to see my treatment, right? And as soon as they surrounded him like they would do me, he immediately capitulated and surrendered the flag and surrendered his oath and took their oath. And then the marshals all turned around to me and they're like, see what we're talking about? I was like, yeah, sadly I get it. And it was a pretty tough pill to swallow. It was like, you hear a lot of talk from people, but to actually do what you say, to me that means something. And it didn't mean anything to him. And I saw it. My volition is that when people see correctness because of their job function position under Title 42, 1986, that they have a fiduciary duty to stop and correct and do the right thing when it's manifests in front of them to be correct. We have a duty to our fellow mankind to be correct and to not lie and to not take shortcuts and to do the correct thing. And that was what I was hoping would have happened with David with that oath. He was trying. He just didn't want to wanted to talk the talk but didn't want to walk the walk. There were people that got their hands on the audio of that, and when they listened to David take the oath, they'll never talk to David again. After the Michigan trials went, I focused on myself. I knew that I figured that nobody cared in the government, that hope was lost as far as that went, because they made choices to be at every turn, at the top levels all the way down. So I figured the government doesn't care about the people. The government cares about themselves and their money and their retirement, and that's all they care about. They want to retire, and some of them really get off on the power over people. They get really, they get all excited to beat people up. I've seen that during my jump through the judicial system, that some people with badges get really, really excited. And they're really good on it. They usually come in like 5, 10 on 1. They're laughing, giggling, knocking you down. I've seen a lot of that. And I figured the government just didn't care. So I backed off, went a different plight. I went into, first couple years were probably some of the best years of my life. I did one other thing during the court-martialing after Michigan. I mailed myself onto a U.S. Air Force base.
What year?
That was in 2007, October of 2007. And I accomplished what I needed to on that mission. I learned a lot about myself. It's always a discovery of yourself before you can help others. Yeah, I went on the base to go down to Panama to meet a banker down in Panama, and I wanted a military escort. I figured I had that right as Commander-in-Chief. So I ordered out specific planes and specific people. So I could, because I was a little upset with the government, so I wanted to talk with and have Richard-Bruce Colin Cheney on the plane with me, because I felt like we really needed a face-to-face. I needed my 5 minutes with him. And anyways, I cleared the military base as Postmaster General. They brought in once they realized what had happened, I was captured by the military police. They were very nice to me, so I wasn't upset with them. They were doing their job. I was doing my function as Postmaster General, Commander-in-Chief. They really didn't have a place to hold me because I was out of everybody's jurisdiction. So they put me in F.E. Warren in the chapel. They held me in the chapel, of all things. They put their security around the chapel. They brought in a couple of stooges from Army intelligence and Air Force intelligence, young men, way over their head. They always bring in the young kids that don't know anything. So it's very difficult. It's like dealing with, I remember what head of U.S. Secret Service told me, corporate policy of the United States government to hire stupid people. And, it manifests with Army intelligence and no-telligence and correcting their badges. And they were very neophytes in communication, didn't know a single thing. How could they? They were brought up in a system that lied to them. So I wasn't upset with them. I was just like, beginners again. Now the CIA did show up, but they refused to talk to me. They talked to the people with me. When they came in to talk to the people with me, they were very trained in quantum grammar. So when they pulled out their badges, my people just put their hand up and went, action, get! And they had to put their heads down and walk out of the room. So CIA put them out of the room. But one CIA agent did turn around to one of the people that told them to beat it as soon as they pulled out their fraudulent grammar authorization BS badges. And they said, does everybody have to have a contract with Russell? And the lady said, yeah, everybody has to have a contract with Russell. And he walked out of the room. So that was interesting. And we didn't really see eye to eye on anything. I was busy cussing them out, chewing them up and down. And they were busy standing there sweating and looking real afraid and stupid. That was unfortunate. You have an image. Of course, I met with their boss, in 2002. He told me it's corporate policy of the United States government to hire stupid people. And that was the head of U.S. Secret Service. So I had a different vision on what Secret Service, and it kind of matched what he said. They were sweating and they said, Cheney's really mad at you for doing this, da, 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 da. And I was like, grabbed their cell phones, slammed them on the ground and jumped in their faces. I was functioning as a commander-in-chief. Probably wasn't very nice what I said. Things have changed. I did go to Washington, D.C. Over Christmas of 2017. In 2018, I did sit down with the Secret Service, and the attitude had changed with them quite a bit, so I was real cool with them for a change. Normally, because of the deep state and the things that they had been involved with, during the Obama administration, I simply refused to go to D.C. and do anything because it was just such a scam. The whole thing was just such an apparatus of theft against the people. Obama was kind enough to send his vice squads after me and raid on labs after F.E. Warren Air Force Base, very heavily into metallurgy. I figured things out myself, and I'm pretty good in that field. So after the F.E. Warren Air Force Base, I did do a few things in the grammar. David Colin Miller and myself, we syntaxed the Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac mortgage contracts. It was almost comical about how they lied to the public about this, the subprime lending, and there's a problem with the subprime lending when the actual contracts themselves were things that were toxic because of the fraudulent grammar, and they were busy fire selling that stuff all over the place. You sit back and go on, why don't these bankers tell the truth? Why don't they tell the people that it's not the subprime lending, but it's the grammar on the contracts that's toxic?
On September 18, 2008, the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Paulson, and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, arrived for an emergency meeting at the Capitol.
On Thursday, late afternoon, they go to Nancy Pelosi's office, and there's a meeting of the senior legislators from both parties in both House and Senate.
In the past 7 months, they had bailed out one bank and let another one fail, nationalized 3 of the nation's largest companies, and watched in horror as the credit markets froze.
It was obviously a big meeting. I had no idea I was going to hear what I heard. We turned it right over to Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson.
And they said they needed authority to use $700 billion to unstop the credit markets.
And sitting in that room with Hank Paulson saying to us in a very measured tones, no hyperbole, no excessive adjectives, that unless you act, the financial system of this country and the world will melt down in a matter of days.
Bernanke said, if we don't do this tomorrow, we won't have an economy on Monday.
When I take your mortgage contracts and I identify all the parts of speech in 15 pages, and I show that there's not a single prepositional phrase, that this is a document with 5,000 syntax wrong words and 1,000 words that mean no contract, and therefore you have 6,000 mistakes and 5,000 words. This is like building a space shuttle to go to the moon. It's an engineering exercise on 64 million mortgages. London got a copy of this. They canceled 64 million title insurance policies in the United States. Mind blown. What's doing canceling United States contracts across the board? Industry. And as Pandora, yes, I'm responsible personally for the entire collapse of the mortgage industry and why all of you are probably in foreclosure right now. Now, for the mortgage people, and this goes with that. Here's how the plan works. We have a document that's a fraud. And this is an autograph, this is a confession. As you know, the bank did not sign any of your mortgages. So therefore, you have what's called a unilateral contract, meaning one signer, which means it's not a contract. You are classified as a borrower or a trustor, ending the word in OR, making you responsible for what? A contract that's written in adverb verb and says nothing. You are responsible to pay back money to a contract that doesn't exist. All the money listed on the document is in a parentheses. So if we have quotation marks, a parentheses, square brackets, or we write in italics. Or if we write on an angle called italics, it means it's removed from the paper and it's blank, which is the condition of all your cases. All right, so we have this document here, and this document says that the bank wants this from you. But he never signed it. So can I prosecute this individual? Well, I don't have a victim yet. You guys have become victims, but only after the fact. Those that are all current in your mortgage payments, you still are sitting on bad paper, but nobody's taking responsibility for it. You've paid, kept your mouth shut, the bank's kept their mouth shut, and you just keep paying. Well, that's cool. Your credit rating reflects that you have made a promise to give something back to somebody else, and you've kept your promise. It's just like a handshake. There's no written contract. This is not a written contract either, until I stand up in front of the court. Now, when the bank stands up in front of the court and says, I wrote this, I'm taking responsibility, I want that house, I now have a signed confession in front of a judge that they took responsibility. Now, it's my responsibility under Title 42, 1986, as a federal judge, to syntax this document and find out what it really says. What it really says is that the false misleading information, fictitious conveyance of grammar, perjury, and deprivation of rights under coloring of the law was now a condition of criminal activity under Title 42, 1986. While engaged in criminal activity under Title 42, 1986, he had knowledge because there's 6,000 mistakes without any kind of modification. In other words, it's a perfect fraud. A perfect fraud because we're back into the no law or fact. And so now he's got this no law or fact document that he's confessed to. Well, from the first one that we did in January of 2008, which collapsed the entire mortgage industry and took the stock market from 14,000 down to 6 and back up again, and put everybody into your quandrum, why hasn't the bank foreclosed you after 90 days? Why didn't they just come out with the sheriff and kick you off the land? Well, that's because we still hadn't had the bankers stand up and say, I did this. So when he did that, he now had what he did was on the 90th day, he filed a Title 46, Chapter 16, Section 781 salvage claim on your land. They killed the Indians, they stole the land, they sold it to an unsuspecting buyer back in 1800, and it hasn't been, or 1834, and hasn't been corrected to this date, and so the word is ailing, A-I-L-I-N-G. Comes from the word failing, with a square bracket around it. Better known as the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure 12b-6. Now, every one of you that have ever worked with me, the first thing that the lawyer does is he failed to state a claim. Okay, what that says is pronoun, adverb, future time, verb, adverb, verb, which means you didn't use a verb in your document. You actually sued them with correct facts, using forensic evidence with a signed confession from the bank who stood up and said, I wrote this. Now I have permission as a federal judge under Title 42, 1986 to prosecute this individual for false misleading information. So all the people that have filed these lawsuits since January 2008, they're stonewalled. We want more information. We want interrogatories. We want affidavits. We want a smoking gun. We want. The point is, the word interrogatory, INT, means no contract. Affidavit, AFF, vowel two consonants, means no contract. We want no contract. We want you to participate in nonsense for 3.5 years of no contract to keep you into a verb fiction. Which means as long as you say nothing about nothing, you can't prosecute nothing with nothing. Which part of no don't you understand, the N or the O? Okay. Now that this fraud has been perpetrated, we go ahead and say, well, I have the signed confession here, and the bank won't settle, and the court won't settle. They're going like, well, the lawyers all, both sides, want more and more information. Well, in the U.S. Attorney's Office in California, they said, well, we've got to find out who wrote this. I says, well, first off, this is owned by a corporation. A corporation is a dead entity, just like this piece of paper is a dead entity, is a vessel in dry dock. Even though you have a president and a vice president, a director of a corporation, who is this individual? He is not a living, thinking entity. He is a corporate trustee. Trustees are created by paper documents. There is no living person to look at. You only have a machine run by a set of rules and regulations. That machine creates the trustee and tells the trustee what to do. But all the language is written in fiction. So what is the subjective interpretation of nothing? Well, at some point here, we have to come to a settlement. So how do we get these people how do we get the machine, the corporation, to sit down and confess to a U.S. Attorney's Office that, yeah, we're responsible, yeah, this was engineered as a lie, yeah, somebody's got to pay. Well, the fine is $25 million times 64 million homes. That's $400 trillion. That's pretty big check to write. The United States Treasury is $17 trillion in debt. The United States Treasury might be $17 trillion in debt, but the United States banking industry has stolen $700 trillion from the United States Treasury in the last 84 years. So what do they do with all that money? Where's it sitting? Well, it's sitting offshore. It's sitting in trusts. It's accumulating interest. And the bank owes the United States government $400 trillion. That's according to just for the mortgages. That's only for 64 million mortgages. That's not counting all the industry, corporations, licensing bureaus, Department of Transportation, and everything else. So this is a really big number, probably $1,000 trillion. Point is, we're only going to deal with the mortgages right now. So I said to the bank, I says, well, the U.S. Attorney though says we can't get past, we've been in court 3.5 years now and we can't move forward. They want more and more and more information. I says, all right, would you like me to settle this? The guy says, no one's been able to settle it. What are we going to do? I says, I'll fix it. So I made a deal with Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and Citibank. Brought all the boys in, sat down and said, hey, you know, guys, you wrote this. I syntaxed it. I have a signed confession in my hand. He says, well, we didn't sign it. There's no signature on there. I says, yeah, but you stood up in court and you held it up and said, I want your house. When you did that, you confessed. And I've got all of your confessions. Because, after all, I have a lawsuit that says here you want their house for not paying the bill. So therefore, you held this up and confessed to it. Now I have a signature signed in front of a judge, and now you're liable. We can't pay that. You'll bankrupt all the courts. All the banks will go bankrupt. Not true. Okay, in this hand here, you've got a $25 million check. Now you're going to confess that you wrote this. You're going to pay $25 million to the Justice Department. The Justice Department is going to get $17.5 million of the penalty, and the whistleblower is going to get $7.5 million for every one of these confessions. Then the whistleblower is going to sign a contract. He's going to get $500,000 in cash. Well, that'll be negotiated anywhere from $500,000 to say $2.5 million, depending on what you need, how big your family is, what your liabilities are. That's negotiable. But the initial thing was $500,000. Okay. Now we've got $7 million left over, and you have to buy a $7 million CD at the bank that just screwed you, who paid a $25 million judgment to the government. What happens when you buy the $7 million CD? They get to fraction bank it at 10-to-1, making $70 million and selling it to MasterCard at 18% interest. And in 9 months, the $25 million is all paid back in interest to MasterCard. The bank goes, we're going to make excuse my French, a shit house of money. And the bank, 10 days later, walked into Kamala Harris's office and said, we got a check here for $26 billion. We'd like to settle this lawsuit. And all the homeowners get paid. March 6, 2012. 10 days after I met with the banks in Oceanside, California. Now that they had a remedy, the banks, Kamala Harris got $19 billion. The United States government immediately took $7 billion, stuck it into the Treasury in the state of California. Kamala Harris then had to hire a staff of individuals, screen out the applications, get all the forms worked, paperwork done. I have those with me, by the way, for those that need the forms. They're involved with lawsuits with me right now. And the bank is waiting for their redeposit of the $70 million for every $25 million they paid out on. And this is in all all 50 federal attorney generals and 1,000 staff members, which are all assistant attorney generals, working with me on this. Now, they are hiring 3,000 more attorneys to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to process 22 million foreclosures in the United States. When you divide 22 million by 4,000 attorneys, that's going to take a while, especially with all the paperwork involved. It's going to result in an $8 trillion a year windfall for a government that functions on $2 trillion a year and only collects $500 billion a year in revenue from the IRS, from taxes. So this is a 16-to-1 payback with my technology. Who am I? I am the cash cow of the United States Treasury. Why do they leave me alone? Why do they let me do what I do? It's because the United States government would not exist after 1997 if it wasn't for me. I paid off the last national debt in 16 months. They were $8 trillion in debt. They not only paid it back, but on November 2nd, 1999, we had $6 trillion surplus in the United States Treasury, entering the third international bankruptcy. And so now, as of last week, we were $17 trillion in debt. With this technology, it's affecting everything. And every single lawsuit, yesterday, Bank of America wrote a check for $2.46 billion for false and misleading information on the wording for the contract for the Bank of America Employees Pension Fund. Biggest single settlement in the Bank of America in the United States pension history. But that is trivia compared to the 26 billion that was written in California to settle the cases, and the 74 billion that has currently been paid out to date on the $400 billion lawsuit, which is at the New York Securities and Exchange Commission for false and misleading information to sell bad mortgages to the Securities and Exchange with a second-grade reading level. Henceforth, this document. But under the Clayton Act, they're going for 4 times damages of $1.6 trillion against the banks. This is just the first 1% of the 22 million cases that are out there. There's a 3% bottleneck in the United States court system. It will take 30 years to go through the 22 million foreclosures. That's why they've hired it. They want to bring this down to 10 years instead of 30 years. Question? You get the interest off it on a yearly basis besides your 5. Just like you win the lottery, you get the interest from the lottery for 20 years. The state keeps the initial chunk of money that you just won, $300 million, and you get the interest off it. It's more money than you can spend within reason against paying for all your toys that you would fantasize for any individual. And it keeps, there really isn't any money around out there. Everything's got to be working. Interest is a working condition of money. So every time they have a problem, they come to me saying, here's the information, sort it out. And it takes me just a couple seconds because I've been doing this since 1997 when I issued new money in the United States. There will always be a condition of foreclosure. There will always be people in bad luck. There will always be, the new contracts, however, have to be written in a new Parsee syntax grammar.
I'm referring to the 7 million CD that I get personally.
No, that'll be just a 10-year contract that you'll have a one-time payout at the end of 10 years. That'll give them a time to, they may bill out MasterCard at, I think it's currently is 14.6%, giving you a 7% commission off of that. 7 times 7 is 49, so that's $500,000 a year for 10 years on top of that, and then a windfall of 7 at the end, which would be reasonable. The bank makes $70 million off the top of that at a 10-to-1 fraction. We're currently paying you paying you the face value of 7, but actually collecting on 63 million all the interest. See? In other words, I confess, no prison, and we'll go ahead and negotiate this plan. You guys win. The federal government gets $17.5 million. They win. The IRS, now, everyone, you're entitled to your minimum wage, $8 an hour. You work 8,700 hours a year on your property to guard the home and the farm. At minimum wage, that's $87,400 a year for the husband and the wife. Anybody on title. Times the amount of years you've owned the property. And under the Clayton Act, it's 4 times that. Then your down payment on the property, if you refinanced, the value of the house you put up for the refinance is the down payment times 4. So it's not a $500,000 property. It was refinanced at 7. The $500,000 value that was refinanced now becomes 4 times at $2 million. So we're talking about a few extra bucks here. Okay, this is taxable income. This goes to, you have your caretaker fees, then you have 4 times your damages. Now the Rescissions Act stipulates under Title 15, Section 1636A, that you must give a 3-day notice that you're going to engage in a false and misleading mortgage contract with only one person signing. That didn't happen in all 22 million or 64 million foreclosures. And the Title 15, Section 1639A stipulates that if they didn't stop and correct the mistake within 3 years of the mortgage refinance, that they are liable to return all the interest to you since the first day. And under the rescissions, under the Clayton Act, you get 4 times the interest paid in. Those you can pull off your IRS forms that you filed with the taxes. These numbers are then calculated by you, and this is the form that the United States government created. Well, it's not the real form. This form was originally written in adverb verb. The form was because you are filing quantum lawsuits to get paid because you have forensic evidence of fraudulent grammar and fraud that's been perpetrated on you. This was also engineered as a fraud so the United States government could keep all of the money, because on the bottom here it says under Title 15, Section 1692E, if you use false and misleading information on this document, you now are vacating your position to collect. And Title 18, 1001, fictitious conveyance of grammar. So if you file a quantum in this hand but file a false claim on this hand, you vacate this claim and you don't get paid anything, and the government gets to keep the whole $25 million for themselves. So I syntaxed this and wrote a brand new form in quantum grammar using the correct parse syntax grammar and filled in all the spaces with the correct parse syntax grammar. Now, if I ask you a question, what is the address of your property? ADD, no rest, which means I just said, what is your no contract property? And you answer me. Therefore, you've stepped onto a landmine. If I ask you, what is the location? If I made the statement, for the location of the property is with the claim of the claimant. That's a correct statement. Now I gave you a location and I made you a claimant. Gold miners didn't file mortgages. They didn't file deeds of trust. They filed claims for their property. And gold was an authority. So therefore, I quantumized this in now time to match your quantumized lawsuit as a quantumized claim. United States Attorney's Office got this. We have a collection agency with Tyrone, Tyrone, Williams out of Arkansas. Now, the first 4 collection agencies that we had hired were threatened with concrete overshoot. They got out. Tyrone Williams was also approached with the same argument. So I intervened. I said to the U.S. Attorney's Office, this is quantum. You're going to get $17.5 million for every lawsuit I wrote. Based on 4 times damages, the average person is going to get $3 million. The government's going to take 1.5 for the IRS. Trustees are going to be paid. Anybody in bankruptcy right now, the bankruptcy trustee is going to be presented with this formula. The bankruptcy trustee is going to see that, one, you're going to get a windfall of $7 million, or whatever In the case of bankruptcy, you will get a check to discharge all your debts, pay off everything, and whatever's left over will wind up being refinanced this way, plus whatever monies you need to be comfortable. This over here goes to the IRS. I don't know about the IRS liability of this, but if you add this to this, the average lawsuit I write is a $20 million windfall for the United States government. Now the judge says to me, we're going to dismiss this. This is gobbledygook. This makes no sense whatsoever. I said to the judge, I says, you know, Your Honor, I'm here in Honolulu, Hawaii, as judge in front of Judge Kern. I got 22 people here. I'm a claimant in all the lawsuits. I says, 25 million bucks a pop, plus $3 million for the IRS. That's $28 million a pop. I says, I don't know what your pay grade is. I says, but you start costing the government $28 million for every person sitting here, times 22, that's $1.4 billion. You're not going to have a job very long. I recuse myself. Before I get kind of getting ahead there. After I said that to him, he says, who are you? How dare you talk to me like that? I held up my oath of office and says, I'm the Chief Federal Judge of the Hawaiian Islands, and I believe I have a warrant for your arrest over here. And right then and there, he recuses himself and he walks out of the courtroom. Well, in comes another judge, Kobayashi. I want appearances. So I gave my name, and first thing out of my mouth was, I says, I saw you standing in the door, so I heard you. I know you heard what what Judge Kern just heard. I says, and I looked at my list and says, I believe I have a warrant for your arrest. And he ran out of the courtroom too. Then Judge Mulloway, she's the Chief Federal Judge of District Court in Hawaii. She comes walking in. I know you don't have an arrest warrant for me, she says. She says, because I was appointed by President Obama just last year. I says, oh, fair enough, you know. I'm still the Chief Federal Judge here, and you're a District Court Judge. I says, oh, by the way, I have your oath of office here. It's written in adverb verb, so therefore you're not a Chief Federal Judge. You're not any kind of a judge. You're just an actor in black robes. I don't care who you are. I don't care what person's name is in this courtroom. If David Miller's name is on there, I want you in this courtroom on April 12th, 2012, at 9 o'clock in the morning. So all 22 of us showed up on April 12th, 9 o'clock, and I walked in the courthouse and got 6 marshals standing in front of me. Judge Miller, do you have your credentials? I says, yep, here's my oath of office, here's my warrants. Are you here to arrest our judges? I'm going, no, I'm just here to go to court. I've got a 9 o'clock appointment upstairs. This is, would you guys like to come with me? He says, well, yeah. He says, we're going to have to. He says, we have orders to accompany you when you enter the building for everyone's protection. I says, who are they? I says, oh, they all were all ordered to be here, along with all the attorneys and all the mortgage companies. He says, well, you're the only ones here. What's this all about? I says, I put a 15-month on all the foreclosures in the Hawaiian Islands. And 5 of the 6 marshals were in foreclosure. They all shook my hand going, well, thank you for not having us kicked out of our home. So they were all in my, I said, would you guys like to come upstairs with me? So we all tiptoed upstairs in Kern's office. We go walking in. And Judge, as soon as I walked in the door, Judge runs out of the courtroom because I got a warrant for his arrest. And I walk up to the clerk and says, well, we're here. Where's Mulloway? He ordered us to be here. And he says, oh, I'll go check. Runs in the back room. There's a whole bunch of screaming going on back there. The clerk comes out all red in the face, and he goes like, the judge has ordered the courthouse closed and ordered his courtroom closed, and everyone is ordered to vacate the building. I says, well, where's Judge Mulloway? You got to go down to the clerk's office and find out. I says, well, the judge has ordered the courthouse closed. So the 6 marshals and I, we go down to the clerk's office, and I have a order opening the court up, ordering with me. I was prepared for all this. I walk to the clerk, says, I'm ordering the courthouse open as Chief Federal Judge. He stamps it, signs it, and I sign it. I said, by the way, where is everybody? Well, the phone's over there, go call. So I called the Chief Judge's secretary, and she picks up. She says, all the judges in the courthouse are on a plane flying to San Francisco. Judge Kern is the only judge in the courthouse, and he ordered the courthouse closed, which is illegal, can't shut down the federal government. So right then and there, I says, all the judges committed treason, vacated their posts, and left the country because they're in international space. So now we got a new complicated lawsuit that I'm putting together. So every time I show up in Honolulu, it's World War III, it's... So these forms were critiqued so that they match your quantum lawsuits, so that you have... I've taken all the precautions necessary so that your language is correct. I took all the boxes off the paperwork, so there's no boxes. The only thing, when the judge, when somebody asks you a question, like, what is the location of your property? Well, you have to have all the words defined, which is in the lawsuit. You have to have your name and address to be legal as far as understanding what an ownership of location is. That's in the lawsuit. You have to have a cause and effect as to why you have ownership and why the bank doesn't. That's in the lawsuit. Because possession is 9 points of the law, and no one ever gave you a legitimate contract, and you've been the caretaker, trustee, and guardian of the property, which puts you on it, and there is no contract. And I mean the word "no" is an adverb, making contract to be a verb, which is an adverb verb fiction. So there is no paper in existence on planet Earth that says you do not own the property as being the original settler on the property. As the American Indians, even though we know the military moved them off, didn't have writing. They didn't have treaties. There has never been a correct parsec, syntax, grammar contract written for that object, and because you are the only person on it, under the maritime law of salvage, are the only people that have ever existed as original owners. Do you have a mortgage? The answer is no. Do you have a debt? The answer is no. Do you own the land? The answer is yes, because possession is 9 points until somebody can show you a correct parsec, syntax, grammar contract that says otherwise. So if the world of fiction wants to play the world of fiction, that's one thing. But when Iceland got a hold of this, Iceland forgave all mortgages in Iceland back in March this year, rather than pay $25 million a pop to Wall Street. So everyone's title clear in Iceland now, even though it's a very small country. You can bring a lawsuit against the bank with the existing contract that you have right now and follow the procedures of suing for false and misleading information on the contract and showing where the bank had Lodial, L-O-D-I-A-L, title to the property. If you're the only person standing and nobody has claim to it and you're on the property, under 1 year moratorium, technically you own the property. Yeah, you'd have to be there 1 year under 1 year damage claim, that no one's ever filed a damage claim against you for false and misleading information. Okay?
And they were bundling and making a boatload of money and didn't even realize that everything they were doing was bank fraud. So to sit back and watch that 2007, 2008 was comical, but it was sad because the American people were getting hurt. And so that I felt bad for, because the people didn't know how to safeguard themselves. They had no apparatus to put themselves in a ship's channel to put their values, their wealth, and then they had a corrupt legal system behind that to enforce the fact that if they did pop up with a fact, that the legal system would lie, steal, plunder, didn't matter how correct you were, it was all a scam, because they didn't want to let go of the fact that they were taken out in 2004. So once the bundling had occurred and the fire sales had occurred of these toxic mortgages, the banks all got bailed out by the federal government. Then the banks took that and fractionalized bank that their bailout money 10-to-1, paid themselves, and kicked instead of giving every citizen who had a mortgage, fraudulent mortgage, a correct mortgage, and give them their title free and clear, they kept the money and charged them more and threw the U.S. citizens out on the streets. This is wrong. Completely wrong. Those banksters need to go to jail. Everybody in the federal government who sent them the funds needs to go to jail, because they were all in on it. The people that got hurt were the citizens here. This was wrong, completely wrong. And I am accountable for the syntexing of the mortgages. But I proved they were fraud. I had set up a construct to stop and correct. The banksters just would not go for it. And so I kind of faded into more of getting asset for asset and focused a 12-year run on figuring out how to use my periodic table to manifest precious metals. And at the end of that, I became very proficient in it. Obama sent his vice teams in from the FBI, otherwise known as the fumbling, bumbling idiots. And they came in and raided my labs, raided my home, and shut me down from processing precious metals because I had developed a system that would safeguard the planet from being mined and yet create copious amounts of wealth. And I had a strategic metals contract with the Department of Defense to do that. But they had more guns and clubs, and I didn't have a security team apparatus around me to stop them raiding my metals in my labs at the time. My objectives with the metals at the time were to help my family, and then to create wealth to where I could backstop nations with hard assets, because of what I realized in the mortgage world is that because of which they made the vessels being the home, made the home a vessel, they put a contract vessel called a mortgage, and that was toxic towards the American citizens. So if I had an asset backed by a slip giving them their home, then they could have their home in equity and not be subject to the fraudulent mishandling of these mortgage companies and the federal government on the citizens' homes and housing and dwellings across our country. In 2002, 2003, I spent a year rewriting a global banking constitution using correct communication, parsing, syntax, grammar, and quantum grammar mechanics on every single sentence. So the sentences could be written frontwards and backwards and still maintain the same volition of what the meaning of the sentence was trying to articulate. I rewrote the bank charters for the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the shipping mechanics to be placed within those constructs to move foreign commerce. I really didn't get into the quantum stock market securities collections for global postal service mechanics. You may see that on the board up there, and what that deals with is it deals with a concept of taking the titles and taking the values that we have created within the citizens that come forward either for posits in the bank. And I say the word posits, not deposits, because the prefix DE means to separate from. So if you go to a bank and you do a deposit, you're separating yourself from your posit or your position. The bank then turns around and hands you a receipt. RE means no, seat is contract, so they give you no contract back. Therefore, you've just separated yourself from your equity or your position. So in our banking system, either in our global-monetary-fund or our world-central-banking system, depending on if we're dealing with a corporation, if we're dealing with private citizens, we do posits. The global, the stock markets that we have, as I've gave publications to every stock market in the world back in 2007. Yes, 2008, I apologize, 2008, January of 2008. And the stock markets around the world kept my quantum stock market that I presented them. The quantum stock market had specific mechanics in it for the placement of values on commodities, on cargoes, on titles. It had correct communication, parsing, syntax, grammar to give a building block for foundations for stock markets. Like I said, I sent it to all stock markets, but instead of accepting some of my registered correspondence, the the stock markets became wise to what I was doing. Instead of refusing it, flipped the documents over, placing a registration stamp on the back of the mailing, and mailed it back to me, which was in the fiction world, they call that a sealed letter of credit, sealed being a past tense pronoun, of is an adverb, letter is a verb, of is an adverb making credit a verb. So it's a condition of state that doesn't exist. We have contracts of the value. So as they came under a consignment consignee for NALM. NALM is the passenger that boards the vessel, such as the green cards that you see in front of the claimant there. The name on the vessel may have been the Vasilis. It may have been the claimant itself, registration to himself. When they came back to my post office where I was staying at the time, the post office says, we got a document here, but we don't know what it is. And they came from 5 different various stock markets, International Court of Arbitration, through the International Chamber of Commerce out of Singapore, Malaysia, Johannesburg, South Africa, Australia, Brazil, Colombia, and a couple other stock markets. I just don't have the paperwork with me, and I apologize because I didn't know I was going to be giving this presentation when I got here. But instead of refusing the documents, they put the registration like I was saying. And so what I did is I placed my autograph across the registered identification from those specific postal systems from the countries that mailed them back to me. And I met with the post office, the postmaster of that specific post office, a postal employee, the senior postal employee for the shift, as well as 2 postal inspectors. And when I placed my autograph across the stamp, saying that this is a contract of the value, a sealed contract of the value, not credit, because this was an actual condition of state of building block. Credit is something that is in the future, so we had a contract. When I placed my autograph across the mail registration, both front and back, the United States Post Office then put their bullet stamp and round 8 seal over my registration from frontwards and backwards. I also then put my autograph across the bullet stamp from those specific countries' postal systems, which made me postmaster, banker of that vessel contract. I then sat down with the founders of the International Monetary Fund families, and I explained to them what I had done. They told me in all functions of postal movements for the bills of the ladings that I was correct. So I'm not guessing at this. This is not a guess. This is actual correctness to create a foundation to take the titles, to take the lawsuits, and put them into our own postal functioning for collections. Now, when you look at the collections, and David did a great explanation earlier about how the Universal Postal Union was trumped because they had full closure under Title 42, 1986, and they were given rescission, and they did not stop and correct, which means they were still modifying they couldn't humble themselves to come to us. Number one probably was 95% because of their uneducation and their second grade reading and writing level. So because they would not humble themselves and come to us for correction, the U.S. Postal Service autographed the stamps for the bills of the ladings and then was able to command a duty, which was to collect of the fiction people that had taken their monies offshore. But when we use the postal mechanics of this, as a claimant comes in or a banker would come in, right? Because a banker is going to okay, so you got title. How do we collateralize this? How do we collect on this? I don't comprehend the mechanics of it. David has placed his autograph across those stamps on those contracts. He has seen those contracts. I have placed them. If a banking system chooses to come in and join with the quiet title for monetization to place liens against it to create monies for their contracts, either through a marshalling hyphen lien or a marshalling hyphen security, it just depends on the bailment that they choose to use. The bank would then come under an amnesty clause that David and I would draft up to allow them to join in the commercialization of that vessel, because they would be joining our function, because we can place our own value on what the values are on the title, because we have a correct survey. We can place the value on our arbitration of it, because On a separate issue from that, I also alerted the International Bank of Settlements, being an adjective pronoun, the being an adverb, international being an adjective, bank being a pronoun, of is an adverb modifying banks backwards, and the verb in front of it, settlements, as well as the International Court of Arbitration. So we could take it in either out of in the personam or in the rem, just depending on the banker's knowledge and how they want to interact with that. So that's kind of where we're at with that for right now. And at the end of Riot, I went and served the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C. In the meetings, I placed the bank charter out on the table, as well as the gold and silver, a sack, or the fee for freight for that constitution, banking constitution. Once the attorneys read the charter, the first 2 pages, they started physically shaking, telling me, "Do you know what this means?" I said, "Yes." And I walked up around the table, around, and reached in between them, and I grabbed the gold and silver, and I said, "And now I'm paying myself to be this person." And what it did was it set up the ship's channels for that constitution to function where other countries and nations could join with it. I then immediately went down to the United Nations with David Wincol Miller, and we spent 4 months cold calling, meeting, being called into meetings with 82 nations at the United Nations, presenting them the banking constitution. It was very wonderful because the diplomats were very kind. There was not a lot of animosity there. They had a lot of questions. A lot of times we would drop the bank charters off, leave them our phone number, they'd call us back, and we'd go in and they'd ask us questions about the contract, about what it meant, especially because they were intrigued that it could go in and out of all languages in the world and lose no deviation in its sentence structure. So they saw great value to that. So what they did is we went in and met with ambassadors, 82 of them. Each one of them said that they had given Constitution, global banking constitution, to their country's treasury, and that the treasury would be studying the styles of syntax and the styles of mechanics to move values within their own constructs. Met a lot of wonderful people. Like I said, they were extremely kind to us. There was no animosity. Some consular posts ran a little different mechanics as far as in China, for instance. The Chinese embassy, they posted up guards around their flag with machine guns. So they didn't fly yellow fringe on their flag. Everywhere else flew yellow fringe on their flags. And now, when you walk into all embassies at the United Nations in New York, they're flying a ball on top of the flag standard on a 3x5 boat flags of that country to walk into the foreign vessel and dry dock. This is correct. However, when you go into the embassy themselves, they're flying spires on top of the flag standards, denoting they're at war with their people. And we actually got about 30 to 35 ambassadors admitting that the United Nations was set up to engage in war against the people. Because of the flag standards, they couldn't get around the protocols of what they were advertising. So we called them on it. And they were, yes, this is correct, you are correct. At the end of that 4 months, I met with I was down at the post office at the UN Plaza there where all the flags hang. And I dropped off my banking charter there because I wanted them to have closure at the post office at the United Nations of who I am. And as soon as I identified myself, they said, "Can you please wait a second?" And they called up to the head office there at the United Nations. And they said, "Mr. Gould, someone would like to talk to you." I said, "Okay." And they handed me the phone. And it was the Postmaster Director, which is equivalent to the Postmaster General of the United Nations. He said, "Hey, we're coming to get you. Just stand put, stand put." It says, "People are coming over, and they're going to move you across the street." So they came in, they sequestered me. the UN people. They were UN, some of them were UN troops, some were just people in suits. And they and David across the street. Well, when we got across the street, we sat down, the head of the Postal Administration, Robert Gray, came to speak with me. I asked technical questions about the mechanics of the fire. And he said, Russell, he says, you are the Postmaster General of the world. He says, I do not have enough knowledge to answer your questions. At the United Nations, we use adverbs, verbs, adjectives, and pronouns. We have no facts here. We're a non-factor in the factual world. I says, that is correct. He says, however, we would like to be your student, for you're the greatest postmaster walking planet Earth. I said, okay, that's cool. And he had his paparazzi, which means people with cameras, and they all lined up, and he shook my hand, and I handed him the bank charter, and he was shaking my hand, and they were taking our pictures. It was pretty interesting. You know, that was my first time really in the public sector on a global level, to where I was seeing that I was making a difference, because they were very receptive to the concept of a math interface on grammar, where you could go in and out of all languages in the world, because they were a corporate umbrella system set up for contracting languages from all different walks around the world. And so they liked the fact that the math that we were using could go in and out of all languages in the world and lose no deviation in its sentence structure. They found great value to that. So that was my, at that point I left the United Nations, and I have not been back. Yeah, when he confessed he didn't have knowledge, the Postal Administrator, that they had no authorization to exist, to move troops, to move anything. It was just a ruse on the ignorance of the people who actually were buying into it. Yeah, and they had no authorization to exist as a corporation, because their charters were in past tense and future tense, which gave it no now space authorization. So that was, to get him to admit to that was pretty cool, and for him to be so kind and, you know, and not be antagonistic towards me, I found very, very, very humbling, and I was very kind back. So that was my story at the United Nations, and it took 4 months to do that. I'd like to speak with the U.S. military about my position as Muster-Master, Master-General, Commander-in-Chief, and Comptroller of the Global Currency, as well as Postmaster General of the world, in correlation with the International Criminal Court of Justice at The Hague. The international, before you go into the military and your specific branches of the military, you physically go in and register, pre-register, and get your registration number from your country's post office. You take that registration number, and then upon receiving that, then you can go into your specific branch of the military. Well, why is that? Because you're in the middle of fighting postal wars, and there's postal settlements that people may choose to make a claim on you later on in life for accountability. During my court-martialing of George Walker Bush and the 5,000 admirals and generals at the Pentagon, I ended up with a chance to file a publication at the World Court at The Hague. When I did that, the head clerk of court wrote me a letter specifically. I syntexed her letter, proving it 100% fraud, autographed the postage stamp filed at the World Court at The Hague, and had someone physically go over to The Hague and file in my position as Commander-in-Chief with The Hague and get it back filed with me. And what that did was it disqualified the judges, because the clerk is the judge. The judges are just actors giving you opinions. Their gavel makes clangs. Clang, clang, clang. The clerk's gavel, being the postage stamp, leaves marks. That file stamp is classified as a bill of the lading. To transport vessel contracts with the bill of cargo aboard the vessel contracts, to bring you in and out of that foreign vessel. However, the clerk of that court at The Hague is bound to performance to the Universal Postal Union in Bern, Switzerland, as a clearinghouse mechanic, which I've disqualified their function at the Universal Postal Union, because I'm Postmaster General of that location. I'm also Postmaster General of the location at the Pentagon. So in order for them to sue Special Forces, Black Ops, hold anybody accountable, they have to meet the grammar standards of the correctness that they all have knowledge of, that I gave importing and closure on back in 2004 at the World Court at The Hague. So if there are soldiers out there that are currently, or where people are trying to come after them for some form of crime, military crime, please contact me. I am the #1 guy for you to hire for services, so I can tow you through their beacons and get the case charges dropped from you or your colleagues. Because all of their clearances are null and void at the World Court at The Hague for the statement of a claim against you, because they're in usury of a fiction with no authorization. The soldiers that are bound to keep secret clearances, because the clearance itself is written in adverb, it says nothing. So you are bound to performance because you are caught up in usury with the post office. I have techniques, if you need out of those contracts, to show you how to navigate yourself so the military branches can't prosecute you for publication on your facts. So you can, I don't want to give those out on the public documentary here, but if there are tricks and there are secrets that I know that you would come under contract with me to tow you through clearing the slate for you so that you could come forward with your technology or your knowledge. It's in the benefit of the safeguard of the public safety here and national security. Okay, so the World Court at The Hague, back to that. The clerk of courts has to, when someone makes a claim against a soldier, they have to come through the State Department and the respective military branches to give closure that there's an action pending. But in order to do that, they're going to have to put a file stamp on that contract so that they can tell you that they're trying to state a claim against you. I have done away with their capacity to do that against the citizens or the employees in the Pentagon. If they board my system and they pay fee for towage for services, I can show them how to direct their correspondence back through a channel that the World Court at The Hague will not be able to state a claim, nor the judges against the soldiers there. So if you have any questions, please contact me.